Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here this afternoon to help open the first in a series of National Archives National Conversations on Rights and Justice. Today's discussion, Civil Rights and Individual Freedom, is both a step towards and a reminder that we must aspire to a more thoughtful approach to civic engagement, equal rights, and our role in American society and democracy.
Our company has evolved alongside this history with our nation, and our company's story, much like our nation's, is one of passion, of innovation, and of people committed to making things better. Just like we never stop looking for the next solution that makes life easier and keeps us all connected, we also know that a better nation, one firmly rooted in justice, requires constant work because justice is not something suddenly realized. It's a continual journey towards a better tomorrow.
We want to use this moment to engage Americans in conversations about complicated issues such as class, gender, politics, race, religion, and sexual orientation through the national conversations. The content of these discussions will build on the National Archives holdings, connecting key foundational documents to the challenges before us. But our larger goal is more ambitious: to advance discussion of these critical issues in communities across the nation and to bring to the forefront challenges to rights and justice that persist 225 years after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. We'll be using several National Archives locations across the country and partnering with other cultural institutions to present this series. The National Conversations on Rights and Justice will be held in Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Washington, D.C. over the next year. I hope you'll join us for future discussions, either in person or online. And I also want to express my gratitude to our partner, the National Archives Foundation, for supporting this series, and a big thanks goes to our lead sponsor for the Amending America Initiative, AT&T. So now let's get started with the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a lovely day. I want you to specifically thank President Carter for giving us this wonderful opportunity. And he's healthy. Look at him. We are so delighted to talk to you today. But there's a lot of things going on, as you can imagine.
I've heard about it, yeah.
And today's conversation is around rights and justice. It's a national conversation that is really, really serious because we see a lot on TV right now, and particularly around the Bill of Rights, which some of them include the 14th Amendment, which is civil rights. Yeah. And I was curious to see and hear from you what you think about civil rights today versus yesterday.
Well, recently I've been reading about the Founding Fathers. I've read a book about James Madison and Jefferson and Washington later, just to see again, after many years of study a long time ago, about those early days of our own country. And as you all may know, the first draft of the Constitution did not include the Bill of Rights, but they couldn't get enough states to ratify the Constitution of the United States until the Bill of Rights were added. And so that was a very major undertaking, and James Madison and others helped to draft those finally accepted 10 amendments to the Constitution known as the Bill of Rights. That did not include everyone. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until after the Civil War when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. And then let me ask you all, when did the women get a right to vote in this country? That's not right. That's when white women got the right to vote. That's a very important thing to remember, because in 1920, the Constitution was passed, but when they said that women had a right to vote, well, you couldn't discriminate because of sex. It just really included white women. And it wasn't until 30-something years later that the civil rights laws were passed when Lyndon Johnson was president after the civil rights movement, and African American women also got the right to vote. So that was an important issue. And then the 24th Amendment came along later, and you didn't have to pay poll tax. But until then, in the South and some southern states, you had to pay a poll tax in order to vote. So you see that it's been a step-by-step progressive element. I would say in the 60s and 70s, the United States kind of breathed a sigh of relief because Harry Truman, when I was on a submarine, ordained in 1948 that there would be no discrimination in the military forces or in the civil service. And then that was about 7 years before Rosa Parks sat in the front of a bus or before Martin Luther King Jr. became famous as the leader of the civil rights movement. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, when that was successful, then, of course, we basically passed the Civil Rights Act and people all over the country could vote. And I and most other leaders in our country kind of said, well, we've finally succeeded. We finally provided for equality of treatment for all of our people. That was a fairly brief period of relaxation and self-satisfaction and self-congratulations. But we've seen lately, particularly with the abuse of mostly white policemen against African Americans and so forth, that we still have a long way to go. So I would say that we've had kind of a relapse. And nowadays there seems to be another stirring of a deeper commitment by our country to take another look at ourselves and see what can be done about the rights for everyone. And this includes the gays and lesbians and so forth, as well as people with different races. So we are in a constant struggle in the United States of America to provide, I'd say, a beacon light for other nations to follow and for ourselves to benefit as well. So
when you think about human rights today versus yesterday.
That's been a very disappointing thing. I'm not just being critical today, but I think the best thing to do is to point out opportunities for improvement rather than just brag on what we've done. We had an era when I was in the Navy of reaching for greatness in moral and ethical values as human beings. It's only happened once in history, so far as I know. And that was immediately after the Second World War, when perhaps 80 million people were killed. And we, in 1945, in San Francisco, we assembled about 45 nations or so, the ones that were victorious in the war primarily. And they established the United Nations with the idea of peace. And the United Nations and its Security Council were designed so that it would prevent wars in the future. A few years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed and adopted with some caveats. The South Africans wouldn't agree for blacks to vote. Russia would not permit free leaving Russia, and so forth. So there were a few caveats, but most of the time people voted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I would say that at that moment, human beings looked at the combined commitment of the great religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and so forth, and Hinduism, and they took the finest elements of every one of those great religions and put them down into 30 brief paragraphs that comprised the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was almost a perfect picture of how everybody should be treated equally, with equal rights. So the United Nations Security Council has abandoned its commitment to peace. If you're a powerful nation with a permanent member and you have a right to veto, you can do almost anything. And the Security Council will not condemn you. I think the United States has sent armed troops to about 30 countries to fight under the general approbation or approval of the United Nations since the Second World War. I grew up during the Great Depression years on a farm. All my neighbors were African American, and all my playmates were black. The ones with whom I worked in the field were black. And until I was a teenager, I never realized that they had mandatorily separate and unequal schools. I never realized that their parents couldn't vote. I never realized that my playmates' parents couldn't serve on the jury, that they were deprived of basic rights. And so it was a time for me to learn all about that. And I believe that we have an obligation now as adults to make sure that our children understand not only the highest ideals of what a society should be, to provide equal opportunity, equal rights to everyone, but also to look at the history of successes in the past and to glorify the champions like Andy Young and Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and others that I need not mention. Jimmy Carter? Well, I'd say Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman.
Behind your back when you're campaigning and they...
I think one of the stupidest decisions that the Supreme Court has ever made was Citizens United, where they ordained that a corporation had the same characteristics under the Constitution as a human being. And now we have massive infusions of money into the political campaigns. When I ran for office, it was completely different. We raised money just a few dollars at a time, and there was a limit on what anybody could contribute. When I ran in the general election against Gerald Ford, who was an incumbent president, and later against the challenger, Ronald Reagan, you know how much money I raised for the general election? Zero.
Zero?
I didn't have to raise any money. We accepted the $1 per person that a taxpayer can indicate on his tax return form. You can check a little check. You have to do it yourself, and that puts $1 in the pot. So Gerald Ford and I shared the money that was in that pot. We didn't ask a single contributor to give us money. And now we have what I would call legal bribery in this country, because every candidate for Congress, for governor, for U.S. senator, for president has to go out to people and ask for money, and you can't get elected if you ain't get considered to be a nominee for president unless you can raise $100,000 or $200,000 or even more. It's hard to see here. It's not Meredith Evans here. Right here. Okay, I want everybody to recognize. Stand up again. You've been very busy.
Yeah.
But Meredith. She's the director of our library and museum, and she's occupies a very important place, in my life as well, and I wanted to recognize her as well.
That's powerful.
Thank you, Meredith, very much. Thank you.